Dr. Naomi Harrison stared at the peculiar equation floating in holographic display above her workstation. The string of symbols represented something unprecedented, the first ever attempt to quantify human emotional responses in terms that the Lemurians could understand. She rubbed her temples, wondering for the 100th time why she'd agreed to this assignment. Dr. Harrison, your molecular coherence appears decreased by 3.2%. The voice behind her was precise, measured, and entirely too close. Naomi jumped, spinning her chair to find Keelthor standing mere inches away, his silver eyes fixed on the handheld scanner he'd apparently been using to analyze her. Like all Lemurians, he had no concept of personal space, or perhaps more accurately, he had exactly one concept of it, measured to the millimeter and recorded in the extensive manual of interspecies protocols. "I've told you before, Keelthor," she said, trying to keep her voice even, "humans don't appreciate being scanned without permission." He tilted his head, the iridescent scales along his neck shifting in what she'd learned was confusion. "But how else would I monitor your well-being? Your species lacks the basic courtesy of bioluminescent stress indicators." Naomi bit back a smile. 6 weeks into their collaborative research project at the Wellington Institute for Xenoscience, and she still couldn't decide if her Lemurian research partner was brilliantly naive or naively brilliant. "We manage just fine with words," she explained. "For instance, I could tell you I'm tired because I've been staring at this emotional quantification matrix for hours." Keelthor's scales rippled with interest, or possibly indigestion, she wasn't entirely sure yet. "Fascinating. You're suggesting that verbal self-reporting of physical states is equally accurate to biometric scanning?" He raised his scanner again, presumably to compare readings. "That's not exactly," Naomi began, but was interrupted by the lab's communication panel. "Dr. Harrison?" Dr. Marcus Walsh's face appeared on the screen, looking apologetic. As the Institute's director, he rarely called unless something had gone wrong. "Could you and Keelthor come to my office? There's been a development with the Oversight Committee." Naomi's stomach dropped. The Lemurian Oversight Committee had been skeptical of their research from the start. Any study of emotions was considered questionable at best on Lemuria, where they'd engineered such evolutionary weaknesses out of their society centuries ago. It was only the potential applications in interspecial diplomacy that had gotten the project approved at all. "We'll be right there," she assured him, ending the call. She turned to find Keelthor already standing by the door, his posture perfect as always. "Your cortisol levels have elevated by 47%, he observed. "Is this anxiety?" "I've been studying the physiological correlates of human emotional states." "Yes, it's anxiety," she admitted, gathering her tablet. "The committee makes me nervous." "Illogical," Keelthor stated as they walked. "The committee simply ensures optimal outcomes through careful regulation of all research parameters." Naomi glanced at him sideways. "Haven't you ever disagreed with their decisions?" "Disagreement implies emotional investment in outcomes. I simply process data and draw conclusions based on objective analysis." He paused, then added, "Though I admit, their prohibition of certain research directions has occasionally seemed inefficient." Coming from a Lemurian, this was practically rebellion. Naomi hid her surprise as they entered the director's office, where they found not only Dr. Walsh but also 2 Lemurian committee members, Senior Overseer Rentil and Research Monitor Vaxian. "Ah, excellent," Rentil said, her scales a neutral gray. "We have reviewed your preliminary findings on human emotional responses to various social stimuli. The data is concerning." "Concerning?" Naomi asked, taking a seat while Keelthor remained standing, as was Lemurian custom. "Your research suggests that human emotions, rather than being mere evolutionary holdovers, may serve practical functions in decision-making and social cohesion," Vaxian explained. "This contradicts established Lemurian scientific doctrine." "Truth cannot contradict truth," Keelthor interjected, surprising everyone. "If our findings reveal previously unknown factors, does that not expand rather than contradict our understanding?" Naomi stared at him. In 6 weeks, she'd never heard him question authority, let alone argue philosophy. The committee members' scales flickered with rapid color changes, their equivalent of whispered consultation. Your extended exposure to humans appears to have affected your judgment, researcher Keelthor, Rentil finally said. We are therefore adjusting the parameters of this project. All future research will be conducted remotely. Direct interaction between researchers is no longer permitted. That's impossible. Naomi protested. The whole point was to study emotional responses in natural social settings. You can't quantify that through remote observation. The decision is final, Vaxian stated. Researcher Keelthor, you will relocate to the isolation wing effective immediately. Dr. Walsh looked pained but remained silent. This was an interplanetary initiative, he had no authority to override the committee's decisions. As the committee members left, Naomi turned to Keelthor, expecting him to follow orders immediately. Instead, he stood perfectly still, his scales cycling through colors she'd never seen them display before. Are you all right? She asked softly. I am. He paused, seeming to search for words, experiencing difficulty processing this outcome. Most inefficient. His voice held a note she'd never heard before, something almost like frustration. That's called disappointment, Naomi told him gently. It's what happens when reality doesn't match our expectations. Keelthor's scales settled into a deep blue. Fascinating. And the sensation of increased thoracic pressure accompanied by a statistically improbable desire to continue our direct collaboration despite clear directives to the contrary. Naomi felt her heart skip a beat. That's something else entirely, she said carefully. Something your committee is apparently right to be worried about. Indeed. His silver eyes met hers with an intensity that defied his species' supposed emotional suppression. Perhaps that is precisely why it requires further study. As he turned to leave, presumably to comply with his relocation orders, Naomi sat back in her chair, mind racing. She'd started this project hoping to bridge the gap between human and Lemurian understanding of emotions. Instead, she might have accidentally sparked something far more revolutionary, and far more dangerous. The question was, what would they do about it? 3 days into the new, remote collaboration, protocol, Naomi found herself talking to a hologram of Keelthor while trying to explain the concept of missing someone. It wasn't going well. But I am precisely where I was assigned to be, his holographic form stated, silver eyes reflecting the sterile lights of his isolation wing chamber. Therefore, I cannot be missed, as my location is known. Naomi sighed, adjusting sensors on her workstation. That's not, missing someone isn't about not knowing their location. It's about wanting them to be present when they're not. Wanting requires emotional investment in specific outcomes, Keelthor observed, his scales shifting to a thoughtful amber. Yet I find myself calculating the efficiency loss of our separated research conditions 16 times per day. Most irregular. Only 16. Naomi teased, then caught herself. Flirting with a hologram of an emotionally suppressed alien scientist was probably not her most professional moment. 17 now, he replied, and she could have sworn there was a hint of humor in his tone. Dr. Harrison, I have been conducting unauthorized observations. Naomi froze. In Lemurian culture, unauthorized anything was practically criminal. What kind of observations? I have been monitoring my own responses. When our direct collaboration was terminated, I experienced several physiological anomalies. Increased cardiac rhythm. Decreased sleep efficiency. Random recall of previous interactions, particularly moments of what humans term laughter. His scales rippled with colors she'd never seen before. I find myself wondering if. The hologram flickered as another figure entered Keelthor's room. Research monitor Vaxian's stern presence filled the background. Researcher Keelthor, why are you discussing unauthorized data? Monitor Vaxian, Keelthor straightened impossibly further. I was correlating observation protocols with Dr. Harrison. Your transmission time has exceeded standard parameters by 7.2 minutes, Vaxian stated. End communication. The hologram vanished, leaving Naomi staring at empty air. She slumped in her chair, worry gnawing at her stomach. Keelthor had never broken protocol before. What was happening to him? Later that evening, as she was preparing to leave the lab, her personal communicator chirped with an encrypted message. Her heart raced when she saw it was from Keelthor, sent through unofficial channels. Research inquiry: is persistent thought about another individual's well-being a symptom of emotional contamination? Related: why do humans press their palms to transparent barriers when separated from those they value? Naomi glanced around the empty lab before responding. Those aren't symptoms of contamination. They're signs of caring. And we touch barriers because we wish we could touch each other instead. There was a long pause before his reply. Fascinating. I find myself with an urgent need to test this hypothesis. Laboratory C7, 2200 hours. She knew she should say no. Meeting in person violated the committee's orders. Her career, their research, the entire interspecies exchange program could be at risk. But she found herself typing, "I'll be there." At precisely 2200 hours, Naomi slipped into Laboratory C7, a rarely used storage space for outdated equipment. Keelthor was already there, his scales cycling through colors so rapidly she could barely track them. "Dr. Harrison," he said, his usually measured voice slightly unsteady. "I believe I am experiencing what humans call anxiety." "That makes two of us," she admitted, keeping her distance. "We shouldn't be here." "Correct. Yet I calculated a 94.3% probability that I would come regardless of rational analysis." He moved closer, his silver eyes intense. "This appears to be what humans call an impulse." "Keelthor." She started, but he held up a hand. "I have been studying human physiological responses extensively," he continued. "Particularly the role of physical proximity in emotional expression. Would you permit an experiment?" Heart pounding, Naomi nodded. Slowly, telegraphing his movements as if afraid of startling her, Keelthor raised his hand. His palm, with its faintly luminescent scales, hovered near her cheek without touching. "Your temperature has elevated by 1.2 degrees, he observed softly. "Your pupils are dilated. These are indicators of emotional arousal, but I cannot determine if it is fear or—" "Not fear," she whispered. His palm finally made contact with her cheek, and they both gasped. His scales were warm, softer than she'd imagined, and they seemed to pulse with light where they touched her skin. "Fascinating," he breathed. "My dermal luminescence is responding to your bioelectric field in unprecedented ways. I should be documenting these readings, but I find myself distracted." "Maybe some things don't need to be documented," Naomi suggested, reaching up to cover his hand with hers. The moment shattered at the sound of footsteps in the corridor. They jumped apart as if burned, Keelthor's scales instantly shifting to neutral gray. The footsteps passed without stopping, but the spell was broken. "This was incredibly reckless," Naomi said, running a shaking hand through her hair. "Agreed. The potential consequences." He paused, then added quietly, "Yet I find myself unable to categorize it as a mistake." "What are we going to do?" "I don't know," he admitted, and the simple confession of uncertainty from a Lemurian was more intimate than any touch. "My training provides no protocols for this situation." "But Naomi." It was the first time he'd ever used her first name. "I believe I am developing symptoms of what humans call feelings." "Those aren't symptoms," she said softly. "They're who we are. Who you might be becoming." "Then I require more data," he said, his scales betraying a swirl of colors despite his controlled tone. "More observation. More experiments." "They'll stop us," she warned. "If the committee suspects. Then we must ensure they don't suspect." His silver eyes held hers. "Will you help me research these phenomena?" Unofficially, it was a terrible idea. It violated protocols, ethics guidelines, and probably several interplanetary treaties. It could end both their careers and set back human-Lemurian relations by decades. Yes, she said. His scales lit up like a sunrise. Then I believe we have established what humans call a conspiracy. I believe we have, she agreed, fighting a smile. As they carefully made their separate ways back to their assigned areas, Naomi realized that in trying to quantify human emotions for the Lemurians, they might have accidentally proven exactly what the committee feared, that emotions weren't just messy evolutionary holdovers, but fundamental forces as powerful as gravity, and just as impossible to resist once you entered their field. The question was, how long could they maintain orbit before being pulled in completely? 2 weeks of secret meetings had taught Naomi more about Lemurian physiology than a year of official research could have. For instance, she now knew that Keelthor's scales turned a deep violet when he was puzzled, shimmered gold when he was pleased, and developed tiny phosphorescent spots when she stood too close, something he claimed had never happened before. They were in their usual hideout, Laboratory C-7, surrounded by defunct equipment that provided convenient cover if anyone walked by. Keelthor was attempting to understand the human concept of poetry. But these words do not convey factual information, he said, frowning at the tablet. The author claims their love is like a red rose, yet human affection bears no botanical similarities. It's a metaphor, Naomi explained, trying not to smile at his confusion. It's about creating emotional resonance through imagery. Emotional resonance, he repeated thoughtfully. His scales shifted through several colors before settling into an unusual pattern she'd never seen, swirling whirls of silver and blue. Like when your presence causes my bioluminescence to synchronize with your heartbeat. Naomi felt her breath catch. That happens increasingly frequently. He set down the tablet, his silver eyes meeting hers. I have been composing sequences of words about this phenomenon. Is that poetry? You've been writing poetry? About me? His scales flickered rapidly. Not by human standards. Merely precise descriptions of physiological responses and quantum probability calculations. For instance, your proximity alters molecular behavior/electronic states shift beyond predicted parameters/ creating unprecedented resonance patterns/ that persist in memory long after you depart. Keelthor, Naomi whispered, that's exactly poetry. Before he could respond, the laboratory door slid open. They jumped apart, but not fast enough to avoid being seen by research monitor Vaxian, whose scales turned an alarming shade of red. This explains the anomalous energy readings in this sector, Vaxian said, her voice colder than usual. Researcher Keelthor, you have violated multiple protocols. Report to oversight immediately. Monitor Vaxian, Keelthor started, but she cut him off. Your behavior patterns show dangerous levels of deviation. You require immediate correction. Wait, Naomi stepped forward. This was my fault. I initiated the meetings for research purposes. Dr. Harrison, Vaxian's tone could have frozen nitrogen, your tendency to emotional manipulation has been noted. The committee will be reviewing your continued participation in the exchange program. She is not manipulating me, Keelthor said, his voice carrying an edge she'd never heard before. I came here by choice. I initiated contact. My actions are my own. Your actions are the result of emotional contamination, Vaxian countered. Your judgment is compromised. Perhaps, Keelthor's scales were doing something extraordinary, shifting into patterns Naomi had never seen documented. It is our judgment that has been compromised by suppressing essential aspects of our nature. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Even Naomi caught her breath at the heresy of it. You will report to medical containment, Vaxian ordered. Clearly, the infection is worse than suspected. I will not. Keelthor's voice was quiet but firm. I am neither contaminated nor infected. I am awakening. Guards, Vaxian spoke into her communicator, security breach in Laboratory C-7. Everything happened very quickly after that. Security drones appeared at both doors. Keelthor's scales blazed with light as he stepped in front of Naomi. She grabbed his arm, feeling the tremors running through him. "Don't fight them," she pleaded. "It'll only make it worse." "They intend to correct these developments," he said, still shielding her. "To erase these feelings." "They can't," she assured him, squeezing his arm. "Feelings aren't just programming to be deleted. They're part of who you are now." His scales rippled with something like hope. "Promise me you'll continue the research. Even if they separate us. Promise me you'll prove that emotions aren't a weakness." "I promise," she whispered, just as the guards reached them. They were separated efficiently, professionally, without any unnecessary force. But as they pulled Keelthor away, Naomi saw his scales spelling out patterns she'd recently taught him to write, human letters, forming words only she would understand. Worth it. The next few days passed in a blur of interviews, examinations, and official reprimands. Dr. Walsh tried to protect her position, arguing that her research was too valuable to terminate, but the committee was adamant. She was relegated to basic data analysis, all direct contact with Lemurian subjects suspended. She heard nothing about Keelthor. Late one night, unable to sleep, she was reviewing their research data when something caught her eye. Hidden in the standard biological monitoring feeds were encrypted packets of data, messages Keelthor had embedded in their official readings, knowing she'd eventually find them. The first decoded into a string of numbers that made her smile through tears, the exact wavelengths of his scales' bioluminescence when she laughed. The second was longer. Emotional responses appear to persist despite isolation protocols. Hypothesis: some changes cannot be reversed. Secondary hypothesis: some changes should not be reversed. The third was the shortest, but it stopped her heart, the mathematical formula for infinity, followed by 2 words. "Keep looking." Naomi straightened in her chair, new determination flooding through her. The committee could separate them, restrict their research, even try to correct Keelthor's emotional development. But they couldn't erase the evidence hidden in their data, the proof that emotions weren't a weakness but a transformation, one that, once begun, couldn't simply be undone. She began to write, documenting everything they'd learned, everything they'd observed. Not just the scientific data, but the personal journey. A record of awakening that couldn't be dismissed or denied. And somewhere in the strictest isolation of the medical wing, she knew Keelthor was doing the same. They would prove that emotions weren't contamination but evolution. Not a flaw, but a feature of consciousness itself. And maybe, just maybe, they would find their way back to each other in the process. After all, as Keelthor had noted in one of their earliest sessions, in quantum mechanics, particles once entangled remain connected, no matter how far apart they're forced. Some bonds, once formed, transcend ordinary physics. Some bonds change the very nature of reality itself. Dr. Marcus Walsh found Naomi in her lab at 3 a.m., surrounded by holographic displays showing streams of data. She'd spent weeks analyzing every piece of information from her time with Keelthor, building a case that couldn't be ignored. "You need to see this," she said without preamble, gesturing to the displays. The changes in Keelthor weren't contamination. They were activation of dormant neural pathways, pathways that exist in all Lemurians. "Naomi," Walsh's voice was gentle, "the committee has made their decision. They're taking Keelthor back to Lemuria tomorrow." The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. "What? They can't, he's in the middle of treatment. They're calling it emergency extraction. Apparently, his condition is spreading." "Spreading?" She pulled up another data set. "What do you mean?" "Other Lemurians in the facility have started showing similar symptoms. Emotional responses, unauthorized behaviors, questioning of protocols." He ran a hand through his gray hair. "They're calling it a crisis." Naomi's heart raced. "It's not a crisis, it's proof. Look at these readings, the neural patterns, the biochemical changes. They're not random mutations, they're natural processes that their society has been suppressing. Keelthor isn't sick, he's just the first to break through their conditioning. I believe you, Walsh said quietly. But they don't want to hear it. They're shutting down the entire exchange program. When? She demanded. Transport leaves at dawn. He hesitated, then added, they're implementing full quarantine protocols. No contact allowed. Naomi stood so quickly her chair crashed over. I have to see him. Naomi, don't. But she was already running. The medical wing was locked down, but Naomi had spent enough time with Keelthor to understand Lemurian security systems. A few carefully timed electromagnetic pulses from her tablet created a temporary blind spot in their sensors. She found him in isolation, his scales a dull gray she'd never seen before. When he saw her, they flickered briefly with color before fading again. You shouldn't be here, he said, but made no move to call the guards. They're taking you back to Lemuria. I know. His voice was flat, emotionless, like when they'd first met. The treatment appears to be working. Treatment? She pressed her hand against the transparent barrier between them. You mean suppression? Keelthor, look at me. Really look. Slowly, he raised his eyes to hers. The moment their gazes met, his scales betrayed him, rippling with colors he couldn't control. The treatment isn't working, she said softly. You're just getting better at hiding it. I have to hide it, he whispered. The others, you don't understand what's happening. Every Lemurian I've contacted since my awakening has started showing symptoms. It's like an activation cascade. Once one of us breaks through the conditioning, we become catalysts for others. That's amazing. It's dangerous. Our entire society is built on emotional suppression. If this spreads. His scales swirled with troubled colors. They'll never let me leave if they know I'm still feeling. Understanding dawned. You're protecting the others. By pretending the treatment worked. They'll take me home, believing the threat is contained. But the changes. His palm pressed against the barrier, matching hers. They're permanent, aren't they? Yes, she breathed. And spreading. Keelthor, I've analyzed everything. The neural pathways, the biochemical changes, they're natural. Your people didn't evolve without emotions, they learned to suppress them. But now we're remembering what we lost. His scales began to glow. Others will follow. The awakening will continue. Let me come with you, she pleaded. We can present the evidence together. No. His tone was final. You must stay here, continue the research. Prove what's happening is natural, beneficial. When more of us begin to wake up, they'll need your data to understand why. His scales spelled out words again, keep looking. Footsteps approached, the guard rotation. They had seconds left. Keelthor, she pressed her forehead to the barrier, I know, he interrupted, his scales blazing with impossible colors. The formula for infinity. I calculated it too. Then the guards arrived, and Naomi had no choice but to run. Dawn found her on the facility's roof, watching a Lemurian transport ship rise into the golden sky. Her tablet blinked with a final encrypted message. Some reactions, once begun, cannot be stopped. Only catalyzed. Keep being a catalyst, Naomi. The chain reaction has already started. She clutched the tablet to her chest, watching until the ship vanished among the stars. Then she turned back to her lab. She had work to do. The awakening was just beginning. 1 year later, Naomi stood before the Interplanetary Science Council, her research displayed on massive holographic screens. The evidence was undeniable: brain scans, biochemical analyses, documented cases of emotional awakening spreading through Lemurian society like a cascade reaction. In conclusion, she stated, the suppression of emotional capacity in Lemurian society was never a natural evolution, but an artificial intervention. The recent awakenings are simply their biology returning to its natural state. The human delegates looked convinced. The Lemurian representatives were harder to read, their scales carefully maintained at neutral gray. But she noticed subtle flickers of color, more than she'd ever seen in formal proceedings before. As she left the council chamber, her tablet chimed with an incoming transmission. Her heart jumped when she saw the origin, Lemuria. Over the past year, she'd received periodic encrypted messages, each containing new data about the spreading awakening. But this was different, a live connection request. She ducked into an empty office and accepted the call. Keelthor's face appeared, his scales radiant with colors she'd never seen before. "Your presentation was most efficient," he said, his formal tone belied by the light show of his scales. "You saw it? The entire planet saw it. They had to broadcast it, too many of us demanded access." His expression softened. "The awakening has spread further than they can contain. Whole communities are remembering how to feel. Are you safe?" She'd worried constantly about retaliation against him. "Safer than ever. They can't take action against us without admitting what's happening." His scales rippled with something like amusement. "Besides, 3 members of the Oversight Committee have begun showing symptoms themselves." Naomi laughed. "Really?" "Indeed. Senior Overseer Rentil was observed crying during a sunset last week. Most unprecedented." His eyes sparkled. "We're establishing new protocols for handling the transition. Which is why I'm calling." He stepped back from the camera, revealing a room full of Lemurians. Their scales were all active with color, none of them trying to hide it. "Meet the Committee for Emotional Reintegration," he said. "We're building a program to help our people navigate the awakening safely. We need human expertise." He paused, his scales spelling out words she'd never forgotten: "Keep looking." Naomi felt tears in her eyes. "Are you asking what I think you're asking? The committee has approved your appointment as chief xenopsychologist for the transition program. If you're interested. If I'm interested in helping an entire civilization rediscover their emotions while working alongside you." She wiped her eyes, laughing. "I suppose I could be convinced." His scales blazed with joy. "I should warn you, emotional expression among awakened Lemurians can be quite intense. We have centuries of suppression to process." "I think I can handle it," she smiled. "When do I start?" "Your transport leaves tomorrow. Assuming you accept the position." "Accepting would be the logical choice," she teased. "Very efficient." "Oh, no," his scales painted patterns of starlight, "accepting would be purely emotional. And absolutely perfect." 3 months later, Naomi stood on a balcony overlooking the capital city of Lemuria, watching the twin suns set in a blaze of color. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of the evening group session, where newly awakened Lemurians learned to name and process their emotions. Warm hands slid around her waist, and familiar scales flickered with phosphorescent spots against her skin. "You're bioluminescent again," she murmured, leaning back against Keelthor's chest. "A common symptom of happiness," he replied, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Most fascinating to observe. Still collecting data?" "Always." He turned her in his arms. "Though I find my research interests have evolved beyond mere observation." "Oh." She raised an eyebrow. "What's your current hypothesis?" His scales spelled out a complex equation that made her laugh. "That's not a hypothesis, that's a love poem. I find the distinction increasingly irrelevant." He touched his forehead to hers. "Some things transcend scientific classification." Below them, the city was coming alive with lights, not just the efficient illumination of before, but colorful displays that reflected the emotional awakening of its people. Art was appearing on buildings. Music floated from open windows. People stopped to watch the sunset, their scales shimmering with unfettered wonder. "We're really doing it," Naomi whispered. "We're helping them remember how to feel." "No," Keelthor corrected gently, his scales painting them both in starlight. "You helped us remember how to live." As the last light faded from the sky, their silhouettes merged against the backdrop of the awakening city, two catalysts who had started a chain reaction of transformation, proving that the most powerful forces in the universe weren't the ones you could measure, but the ones you could feel. Some called it an experiment gone wrong. Others called it an evolution. Naomi and Keelthor simply called it love, the most perfect solution of all.